Hello, my name is Andrew Thake and I'm from Mines and Money. Today's panel is discussing how well is the gold industry driving sustainability development goals in its operations. And joining us today, we've got a panel of miners and industry experts to go and discuss these issues. We're joined by Annie Markova, who's a non-executive director of SilverCrest Metals and also Critical Elements Lithium. Estelle Levin-Nally, Chief Executive Officer of Levin Sources. Lara Smith, Co-founder and Chief Executive Officer of Core Consultants. Philippa Varis, Non-Executive Director for EnviroGold Global and Head of ESG at Horizonte Minerals. And Hannah Brandstaetter, ESG Program Director at the World Gold Council. Welcome to you all. Perhaps I can kick off with an opening question for yourself, Estelle. Just for those of you who aren't familiar with them, what are the Sustainability Development Goals?
Okay, thanks so much, Andrew. So the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals were adopted in September 2015 by 193 countries as part of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. This is a 15-year plan to end extreme poverty, end inequality and injustice, and protect the planet. And at the heart of that are 17 global goals, the UN SDGs, as we call them for short. Now, these cover really diverse issues: poverty, hunger, health, gender, water, decent work, economic growth, many more. But there are two cross-cutting goals that I think are worth shouting out, because there's general consensus that none of the other goals can be achieved if these aren't pursued adamantly. And that's Goal 16 on peace, justice, and strong institutions, where major issues of concern to gold like human rights and anti-corruption sit. And also Goal 17 on partnerships. And we see a number of really successful and exciting partnerships in the gold sector that help support that. So there is a certain expectation that comes from having the UN SDGs for business, but also for governments. So the expectation is that governments should use their mineral resources in ways that help achieve the goals and don't undermine them, and that's really important. So it's things like investing in good governance, a coherent policy, law and regulations, ensuring there is integrity, ensuring that the government understands and implements its duty to protect human rights and other things. But for business, there's a really crucial role to play, and that's for all businesses, not just mining companies, but refiners and investors as well. And that's down to how they do business and the standards that they apply. And there's a number of initiatives that are designed to help the gold industry achieve the UN SDGs, and I can talk more about that later if you like.
So turning to Hannah, what has been the overall response of the gold industry?
Well, I think I'm going to start off with something that Estelle just said, which is there's a lot of initiatives that help advance the SDGs. And for us at the World Gold Council, for instance, when we developed the Responsible Gold Mining Principles, which is a set of 51 principles, detailed principles that cover the E, S, and G, we made sure that we align them to the SDGs to really look at where's the close alignment to have the most impact. And the Responsible Gold Mining Principles, there are membership requirements for members. There's also other non-WGC members that have decided to report against them, but they are externally assured by a third party, and they're publicly disclosed. So I think that's very important. And then we at the World Gold Council, we always look at what is the gold industry doing, what are our members doing? And so in 2020, we looked at how is our membership contributing to the SDGs? And it was a questions that we heard from investors and other stakeholders. And we very much focused on, within that report, on case studies, because I think often, the positive impact isn't really understood. What is it that miners are doing on the ground? And just to give a few examples, and I'm sure Philippa, I know, has great examples that are often used, what she's been doing, so I'm not going to go into that. But some examples, for instance, are AngloGold Ashanti in Ghana. They had a very successful, still going, a program that helps tackle malaria. And it started at their mine, their Wasi mine, and then in local communities, very much focusing on education, on diagnostics, improving access to diagnostics. And that's really grown. And they've had, that program itself had, for instance, 138 million went into this from the Global Fund. So you can see that, something that happens at a mine can very much quickly grow to the communities, of course, and then further in country. Another example would be something that EnviroGold is doing in the Sahel region, where they invested $10 million to help improve access to drinking water, to sanitation. And so there's loads of examples I think that we can talk about. And what was interesting to us was when we released the report, people were like, that's great stories, but can you put some numbers towards it? What is the impact and how can we put some numbers towards it? And especially investors are always keen to understand that. So last year we looked at trying to do that, and we gathered data from our members, data for 2020. And I should mention, it's just a snapshot. It was also a very successful year for gold. It had the highest gold price that we've ever had. But we looked at 2020 data, and we asked our members to provide us with data for 4 main categories, which was payments to employees, payments to governments, payments to suppliers, and payments to communities. And we looked at data in-country spent and out-of-country spent. And it was a great exercise, and we're very grateful, because it's hard to actually get all that data and then consolidate it. And what it found was that out of the around 60 billion of gold revenue, 63% of that contributed to a GDP of host nations. So just to give one figure here, and in that we looked at 112 mine sites, 82 non-producing sites in 38 countries. So we did cover quite a bit of ground. And I think it's important to put those figures towards it as well, because you know, all industries, it's important obviously to profit from what you're doing, but I think the gold industry and gold mining is really making a difference on the ground, and a lot of the effort is going into responsible mining that in turn that helps with economic development.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for that. You mentioned a couple of sort of specific examples there that the gold mining companies are doing. So at this stage, I'd be quite interested in bringing our two gold mining guests. Starting off with Anna Markova first. Can you kind of give us some like ideas as to the gold companies that you've been involved in, what sort of practical initiatives that they've undertaken with regards to sustainable development goals?
Yes, hello everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to share my thoughts. As board members, we have the fiduciary duty as stewards of corporate assets to oversee the alignment of all stakeholders' interests in order to secure social license to operate and fulfill the long-term purpose and mission of the organization. We cannot talk about the long-term SDG contributions without framing the conversation around the difference in the mine life of gold companies, which is on average about 10 years, versus other commodities, which could be as long as 30 and more years. Also, there are many pressures on the profit margins of gold mining companies, and most of them are smaller companies. So being price takers and exposed to inflationary pressures from labor, suppliers, energy, can potentially hinder the commitment to any of the natural, human, social, or financial capitals. So the way I see it, gold companies can be the catalysts for setting communities and regions on the path for more sustainable existence, but they cannot be the sole solution provider. Mining industry knows very well what the social license to operate means, but there are different ways to get it done. We need to better educate and collaborate with all stakeholders. We need to engage our communities, governments, labor unions, suppliers, capital providers, NGOs, and all others in order to have their buy-in and participation. Because shareholders are still expecting returns on their investments, and all other interested parties need to be able to carry on with all the programs long after the mine is closed. And if there's no profits, there's no programs. I would like to give you an example as to how we have tackled some of those challenges through an example that we're currently undergoing at SilverCrest. It is happening as we speak. We are in the process of building Las Chispas mine in the Sonora River Valley. As you probably are aware, agriculture accounts for about 75% of water usage in Mexico, and most mining companies use about 2 to 5% overall. Same is for the region as well. So we've identified that water is our #1 business risk. And especially in the context that a few years prior, there was a cyanide spill in the river and it impacted a lot of communities. So there's very, very heightened sensitivity to water as a shared resource. So we've tackled it straight on. We have focused now on mine design that utilizes underground water sources, but we didn't stop there. We ran scenario analysis to see what is the climate change in the region and what are the impacts 5, 10, 20, 30 years down the line. And within that TCFD kind of a framework, we've identified that we will see a lot higher extremes of flooding and heat and drought. For that reason, we built a bridge that can withstand such big impacts, but we also recognize that the communities will be much more impacted by that climate change. Mine only draws 0.5% of what the community draws from the riverbed. However, that can lead to big disagreements down the line and potentially us losing our social license to operate. So we've also identified that the community has not been able to maintain their sewage infrastructure. And that's why we have had to tackle that one on as well, to make sure that there's clean water that is going back into the river. So what we did is design a water stewardship plan over the next 5 years, where we will be aligning not only our communities, farmers, ranchers, but also the government institutions to form an alignment and tackle straight on the improvement of aqueducts to reduce water losses. What these impacts would lead is actually a lot higher positive impacts for the communities, because garlic farmers will be able to have more yield, and the ranchers could actually grow their own feed, reduces their cost of having to spend on expensive feed during dry seasons. So those are going to be the points that we will be addressing the different stakeholders and aligning them with the efforts we're undertaking. That takes leadership, and the team in Mexico has done a fabulous job driving that initiative. And this is how a smaller company like SilverCrest can align and contribute positively to SDG number 6, which is water and sanitation.
Thank you very much for that. I saw Philippa nodding ahead to much of what you were saying there. Obviously, you've just recently joined Horizonte Minerals, and I should have added, actually, I missed out in terms of openly, when I sort of introduced you, you were previously at Golden Star Resources, which actually won the sort of the Mines and Money ESG award last year. But either from your experiences at Horizonte or maybe from your previous experience at Golden Star, can you talk about some of the initiatives that you've been undertaking?
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's fair to say that the SDGs have really captured the hearts and minds of people working in the mining sector overall. We've seen ourselves the positive impact that our operations can have on host communities. So the opportunity to contribute to societal goals, and, you know, to Estelle's point about SDG 17, the opportunity to collaborate and work with host governments and with host communities on driving these improvements for a more inclusive and equal society really resonates with our industry. Just to take a sidestep before I give you an example, I did a little bit of research myself today, and I looked at the United Nations Global Compact, which is one of the major programs that has been established to help support business in general to deliver the Sustainable Development Goals, and prior to that, the Millennium Development Goals. And I think it's worthwhile noting that there are over 259 mining and metals companies that are signatories to the Global Compact. And they cover more than 50 countries that their head offices are located in. But I think most tellingly is that 63% of those new members joined since the inception of the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think that really illustrates that point around how this has captured our imagination, and really it's a pathway for the sector to really contribute in a way that has global meaning. Now, to use an example from Golden Star Resources, there are 2 key Sustainable Development Goals that we really focused on contributing to. Those that relate to poverty and decent work. One of the issues that the mining sector has in emerging economies is the boundary or the interface between large-scale formal mining and small-scale and sometimes large-scale illegal or artisanal mining. And one of the pieces of work that we did as an organisation was to bring about an array of systems and programs to try and help mainstream people who had been involved in illegal mining into the formal sector through collaborative partnerships. We helped a group of local companies who were less formal to become formalised and to start to deliver mining services and mining contracting to our company, which helped them to mainstream and formalise. And Golden Star also did a very large program, which has now been running for over 15 years, to again really create those linkages between sectors around agriculture, which is actually the mainstay of the Ghanaian economy, and the gold mining sector, by helping to develop an agricultural company which undertook all of the land management controls for the organisation, but also developed a productive and sustainable business for host communities in the areas of our mines. So really exploring those synergies between what the company was doing and needed and what the host community was doing and needed to bring about those opportunities to collaborate. The business that Golden Star established in oil palm, the Golden Star oil palm plantation, finished up employing, well, at the time that I finished with the company, was employing several hundred people, having impact on the lives of over 2,000 people. And all of those employees working in that agricultural business were earning several times the base wage in Ghana. So it was agriculture, but highly productive, without impact to forest. And credit to GSOP. GSOP looks destined to become one of the very first oil palm companies in Africa to obtain the Round Table for Sustainable Oil Palm certification. So the certification as being a sustainable oil palm producer. So I think that's a fabulous example of the SDGs in action.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. I probably should have asked this as the opening question, but we'll ask it now. And I'm going to actually ask it to yourself, Lara, first, actually, if it's okay with you. The panel title was "How well is the gold industry driving sustainability development goals in its operations?" How many marks out of 10 would you give the gold industry, and why, Lara?
10 out of 10 for effort. let's start there, because the World Gold Council has really made it clear that to be a part of it, you have to adhere to these standards, and they're working really hard to transform the industry. But what we actually have to understand about gold in particular is that its proposition to society, more than it just being a store of value or used in jewelry or the various uses in technology. From a social perspective, there are major issues where gold in particular can contribute unlike any other metal. And the reason for that is, firstly, large-scale gold mines can create significant opportunity through the surrounding communities, through direct employment, but also through economic linkages, which the other panelists have alluded to and have given examples of. And the second thing with gold is that gold is often found in remote or less developed regions. And we've spoken about Mexico, we've spoken about Ghana, and there's normally a lack of major employers there for infrastructure and government services. So gold mining companies are often the only employer, the only catalyst for growth, the only catalyst for development in the region. And it's really up to the gold industry to create sustainable opportunities for that.
Thank you very much for that.
The dogs.
Yeah,
the dogs support you.
Yeah, I'm not sure if this sort of like canines are barking you within in sort of agreement or sort of like disagreement. Turning over to the other sort of four panelists, Would you sort of like have anything to add to Lara's sort of comments? Would you score differently? I'm just kind of keen to turn it over to sort of any of you that has sort of a slightly different perspective.
Oh, I like the point that Lara captured around gold often, and other mineral commodities as well, for that matter, often being one of the first large-scale formal employers in emerging economies, and the you know, the kind of opportunity as well as responsibility that goes with that. I've also observed in my own career the benefits that gold mining in particular can bring to revitalizing remote regional communities. I think all of us know examples of, you know, old towns that weren't necessarily mining based that were rejuvenated by the arrival of mining into those regions. And there's been a real drive across the sector over the years to try and really enhance their work in these regional communities. And in many instances, the mines, you know, are not just bringing resources and infrastructure, but I think importantly, one of the things we forget about is research and capacity. If we look at the knowledge, the scientific knowledge that we have now about the world, not only in terms of mineral resources, but also in terms of the natural world, and the role that the sector has played in knowledge of these locations, and the importance of the protected environmental values and cultural values in those locations. Now, I think it's another really important contribution that we don't always capture. So, I mean, that's just like a little bit of a sidebar from me.
Sure. A slightly different question to yourself, Annie. Obviously, you in a previous lifetime, I appreciate this, probably like five or so years ago, you used to work as an investor, and you were a gold and natural resources fund manager. How well do you think the investors think the gold mining industry is doing when it comes to sustainability development goals?
I believe that most investors will agree with me that this is crucial for the companies to be operational. So this sometimes is taken for granted, that the companies, is their responsibility, they need to meet all these goals and be good corporate citizens. But when I made a remarks that we need to align expectations of all stakeholders, that included investors, because there's always a cost associated, an investment that needs to be done in the short term to get more of a longer term positive impact. So I think that communication needs to continue. I think that now, with the teams being a lot more structured around their due diligence on ESG topics, they could better understand and document the progress made, and that the companies can be held accountable for achieving goals, because those goals does require shareholder capital to get to the level where they needs to be. So this is an ongoing dialogue. I think it's very important for the companies to continue to quantify their investments and impacts, because that will help get that recognition that actually there's a lot more to the valuation of the gold companies than currently factored in.
Mm-hmm. Hopefully, if we've got Lara now back online with us. Lara, I'm just interested, do mining companies still see ESG as a risk rather than opportunity?
Yes, they definitely still see it as a risk, but it's less of a risk or less impactful than what it was. And I get my data from the EY risk assessment. Mm-hmm. And what they did in 2021 was they asked mining companies, where do you feel is the greatest risk? 46% of respondents felt that the greatest risk was in ESG and sustainable factors. This is still the leading cause of risk, but if we had to ask that question again, the supply chain disruptions, the idea behind decarbonization and trend towards that, the unknown from respect to demand because of decarbonization and the actual demand going forward for the metals, and a slowdown in China has also been cited as key risks. It still remains a prevailing risk, but less so than it once did.
Mm-hmm. It certainly is a follow-up question. It certainly seems to me there's also a bit of a division there. But when I talk to gold producers, they seem to be much more on board with ESG as an opportunity and as something that can really add sort of like value at all levels of the sort of business. But it's still probably more, I guess, at the exploration stage where I see sort of like a greater sort of like perception of seeing it as being more of like a risk rather than as something to go and embrace and move fully forward with.
Yeah, Andrew, let me give you an example of, a mining company using ESG really as a key driver for the business. So a lot more proactive as opposed to, reacting to the situation. Mm-hmm. In Golden Star Resources, in collaboration with the National Government Health Services Ministry, the Ghana Health Services, and NGOs from Project Cure, the company delivered a several-year campaign of neonatal resuscitation training to medical services providers in host communities who quite frankly had not had this training and didn't have any of the equipment to deliver these skills. And in the course of that program, the company and their partners were able to directly contribute to a dramatic reduction in neonatal mortality in the host communities, to the extent that I personally went and visited with some of the host communities to really kind of validate the numbers that we were seeing. And in talking to one of the nurses, he said to me, well, Madame, look over here, look at this small child. And I did, and I saw a small child playing, underneath a tree. And he said to me, Madame, because of your program, I was able to save that child's life.
Yeah,
I don't think any of us believe that it's necessarily the job or the role of mining companies to be contributing directly to national health programs of this nature. Mm-hmm. So I think we can all agree that this example is one of true proactive use of the SDGs as a driver for performance improvement in the industry.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I'd like to add to add to what Philippa said, which is an amazing example, but you asked about the earlier stage companies. I think the earlier stage companies, the exploration companies, are the ambassadors for the mines that come behind if there's success in exploration. And they actually have a lot more impact at earlier stages to engage with all stakeholders, to actually be boots on the ground, to understand what are the key hot topics, how is the natural habitat there going to be impacted. I mean, those are all wonderful, wonderful research points that they are responsible for, but they're also the face of civilization, the way, and the mining industry per se, coming into such remote areas. So there's a lot of training, I think, needs to happen. And how do we leverage our exploration teams better to drive and to be sensitive to human rights issues, to be able to properly engage and open the doors for future collaborations. I think there is a disproportionately more emphasis being put on the front lines, and exploration and community workers have a lot more to share in that regards.
Thank you for that. I think that Estelle, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I think it's important to think about this from a double materiality point of view. I was really interested in Annie's example of how SilverCrest identified water as the major risk to them, but they also saw how it was a major risk to the communities. So that's one direction. How are we impacted by this ESG factors, by SDG factors? But the other is, how do we negatively or positively drive risks in those domains as well? So that's called the double materiality axis. And it's normal for boards to think about the risks as they're opposed to us as a company. What the SDGs does is it compels you to think about how do we generate risks for others, and also how can we generate opportunities for others in what we do, and can we maximize those? And that's where the creativity comes from here, and the innovation, and that sets the UN SDGs apart from other ways of thinking about risk, because it makes mining companies compelled to think about being part of the solution it's going beyond doing no harm to saying we have power to do something positive. So let's deploy our assets to our benefit, actually, at the end of the day, as well as the benefits of stakeholders, and really maximize that opportunity. It's a mindset shift and it's a cultural shift. And that's where you see a difference of companies along the spectrum of those who are just coming towards this now, and there's a struggle to really capture that part of it, and those who are much more sophisticated in their thinking, like SilverCrest, like SilverCrest, sorry, Golden Star and SilverCrest, and who can therefore demonstrate these really exciting examples of when a mining company has gone, what others might say is above and beyond, and what I would say is exactly where the mining sector needs to be, to have a legitimate stake in the green transition and in part of, you know, a sustainable future for everybody.
Mm-hmm. Hannah, I think we were sort of like talking about this like a few weeks ago when we were doing a preparatory call in advance of this panel. But I think that you and the World Gold Council have done some very interesting work in terms of looking at sort of like how well the mining industry, how well the gold mining industry is working with indigenous communities, where there's percentage of locals employed, and there's some interesting initiatives and results you found there. Would you care to share them with us?
Yeah, sure. I think that kind of goes back to the report I mentioned earlier. And I think, you know, a lot of questions from investors around, you know, social impact and how do we measure it? I think, you know, there has been such a huge focus on the environment and climate change, and, you know, investors and stakeholders are kind of getting to grips with how do we measure that, but how do we measure companies from a social impact point of view? And one thing that always comes up, or very often comes up, is around, you know, this perception that a gold miner goes into a developing country and they bring a lot of expertise and overseas talent over, and they take away from local communities the opportunities. And so we really wanted to put figures on that. And so the research we did last year for 2020 data, again, that's 112 mine sites, 82 non-producing sites, we found that actually 95% of the workforce, our members' workforce, is employed locally, so the countries that they operate in. And we did a similar exercise back in 2013, and around that time it was 90%, so that's grown by 5%. And you know, people are always surprised by that number. You know, how is that possible? But I think what's even more important, that's great, but how many other jobs does that support? And you know, the figure we got to was one mining job supports another 6 jobs down the supply chain. And the wages as well, you know, some of these mining jobs are the best paid jobs within these countries. So they're on average 6 times higher, a lot more in some of the developing countries, but just for our membership, it's about six times higher. And I think these are the figures that, you know, people always are surprised at, this impact and this kind of multiplier effect that the industry is having. So I think that's very important. I think, you know, the work that's going on with indigenous communities, and also, you know, going back to responsible gold mining principles, there is a specific principle on that. It's also included within working with communities. And I think, you know, that those are all very important aspects to make sure that when miners go into these countries, that the local community also very much benefits from having these mines around. And if I just can make a very quick point on the question before and what Estelle said, I think there's so many opportunities to really have impact with communities. And I think climate change is a risk, but it's also an opportunity. And I think what companies are going to do in terms of decarbonizing their mine sites, how they will benefit communities, and how they work in partnership again with governments and other stakeholders to ensure that these benefits continue, will make, you know, a huge difference.
Mm-hmm. So I guess there's an issue of climate change. Going to Annie first. How can the gold industry further reduce carbon emissions?
We have to look at all possible options. So I would like again to put in the context of there's different mines that are located in different geographies. Sometimes it is easy to connect to a grid, and then you are aligned with the national efforts to decarbonize electricity grids and electricity power production. Sometimes the remote locations cannot be electrified. It needs to rely on other GHG heavy fuels. To me, the step number one is to look at efficiencies. Are the operations running efficiently? Are there any energy savings that the operation can achieve? Is there a different way of doing the work, sequencing it? Is there any others? Because any incremental small electricity save or energy save actually is positive to the profit margin of that operation. So that's direct economic incentive to look at efficiencies. The companies could also look into carbon offsets, investments in programs that could lead to carbon credits. That could only work in an environment where we have a unified carbon taxation system, and those credits could translate to direct financial savings for the company. There's got to be an incentive. So I'd like to say we're all looking at opportunities, how to reduce carbon footprint. Electrification of the new mines such as Las Chispas is absolute a must, and we're doing that. But there's still more efforts that need to happen in that direction. But that requires alignment with the national governments, and then more global efforts. So I'm sure others could contribute to that point as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, Annie, I think kind of, oh, sorry. Do you mind, Andrew? I think I'm picking up where Annie left off. I'd like to just point out a really important study that the World Gold Council has done in 2019, which categorized actual industry data on where the emissions are coming from the gold sector. And I think it's really important for those who are unfamiliar to note that 43% of the industry's emissions are scope 2. So that relates directly to electricity consumption. And another 36% are primarily from fuel that's utilised in fleet. So fleet being the word for the heavy equipment and mobile equipment being utilised in the mines. So these two really are the key parts, the material parts of the gold sector's contribution to the emissions that it has. And to just provide some examples of, really fantastic sectoral leadership in this area, and I'm impressed by these. IAMGold has built one of the, I'm looking at my notes, so forgive me for looking down, has built one of the world's largest hybrid solar thermal plants in Burkina Faso. So they're off grid, okay? And they've effectively built a renewable or a hybrid renewable, because we all know that the sun's not out all the time. They've built a hybrid renewable power station for their operation, which also supports their host communities, people which didn't have power otherwise. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, we've got Barrick's Kibali mine, which has developed an 11 megawatt hydropower station. Now, traditionally we think of power supply as being something that government should do, but here we have examples of the mining sector going that step beyond and actually driving this change towards renewable power. To speak to that point around direct fuel consumption and emissions, we've got a great example of Canada's Newmont's Borden mine, which is set to become one of the first all-electric underground mines. Now, again, for those who aren't aware, the solution isn't 100% in place yet. Borden and the Newmont team have had to really drive the innovation in partnership with their heavy equipment fleet operators to produce equipment that can actually operate from electricity. These things didn't exist before this became part of the agenda that the mining sector established in its ambition around the SDGs and around decarbonisation. Likewise, Kirkland Gold, who started off as a small company not that long ago, they became, and to quote one of their senior leadership, they were the battery electric pioneering guinea pigs. So we've got gold sector here, really working hand in hand with other industry, with governments to drive this decarbonisation agenda forward. And I think, you know, fortunately for gold, in many respects, that pathway to decarbonisation is somewhat clearer than it is for other sectors. And we've seen some really great movement on the ground as the industry becomes coherent in how to take these next steps. But more work to do. I have to agree with the other speakers. We're not there yet by any means, but there's a pathway and it's a clear one.
Andrew, if I could just complement what both Annie and Philippa have said, please. I think there's two additional elements here. Both have made reference to technical solutions, electrification, which are massively important. I think generally taking an approach of circularity and dematerialization to mines is really important in gaining efficiencies, not just in energy, but also in other natural resources that we depend upon, like water and so on. But actually, when you think about miners as being linked into broader economic supply chains, the initiatives that seek to dematerialize tailings and convert waste into product or input for other sectors is a huge opportunity to also decarbonize other sectors. So we become part of the solution there. And then the other missing piece is, of course, nature. Mining's relationship to nature is an enormous opportunity, not just to manage carbon emissions, because a third of global carbon emissions comes from deforestation. And of course, the tremendous amount of digging that leads to the destruction of mycorrhizal networks in soil, which sequesters gigatons every year of carbon. But actually looking at nature as an opportunity and capturing that for carbon benefit also brings benefits around biodiversity, water, human rights, and many other things. So this is why you have things like the World Bank's Forest Smart Mining Initiative. And they've got two major studies being published this month and next month on both ASM and LSM, large-scale mining, for nature-based solutions there. So keep an eye out for those. But I want to make sure that we keep nature in mind, because I think for miners and investors, it's very easy to think always just in terms of technology and business models. And I think that it's kind of harder for them to think in that creative way that may include nature as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for that. Hannah, how well is the gold industry contributing towards gender equality?
Well, I guess I have to start off and acknowledge that we're an all-female panel, and that doesn't happen that often. I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done. I think, the mining industry average of women working within the sector between 5 to 10%. For our membership, it's around 17, so it's a little bit better, but it's still very low. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done. But I think there's willingness, and there have been changes. And so I'll give a few examples. I think there has been focus on improving female representation at boards. And I think there's been a real drive of changing that. I think, again, for our membership, it's about 24% now, but there is a few members that have reached gender parity, and there's a lot of them that are working towards that. So really looking at, senior leadership, looking at boards and female representation. I think there's work that's going on around. So to give an example, I think according to the World Bank, it's about 60 countries that don't allow women to work in mines or in underground mines. And so there's work that's going on there. So one example, for instance, would be one of our members, Resolute, who has a mine in Mali. They've been working with the government because according to the labor code, women are not allowed to work underground. So they've been showing, this is how we're helping women. This is how we're supporting, training, mentoring women at our mine site. But we want to give them the same opportunities as men. And that includes working underground. So they have been able to get an exemption to that labor code and to provide that opportunity for women, which I think is a great example of how we can help, women within the industry. Another example I would give is focusing around communities, right? There's a real opportunity in working towards gender equality when we help communities. And one of our companies that works in Mauritania, I had a conversation with the head of communities last year, and she just kept on saying, men and women, we're now equal in the community. And I was like, well, that's fantastic. how, like, what does that mean, right? And she explained to me that, you know, before the mine came in, that wasn't the case. And I was like, okay, well, how did the mine help you? And she explained to me that, you know, the mine, and that's Kinross, they helped build cooperatives. And she said it was things like helping them understand, how do you write a contract? How do you sign a contract? What are basic accounting techniques that you can learn? How do you build a business? All these things. And so they now have very successful cooperatives, and they do sewing, they provide food for the mine, all sorts of things, and they adapt. So during COVID, they provided the masks, they started sewing the mask, and they have a real purpose, and they have an opportunity to contribute to the economy of their communities. And so I think there's a lot of work that's going on within the sector to contribute to SDG 5. I think it's a focus for a lot of companies, but I think there's a lot of work that still needs to be done.
Mm-hmm. Estelle, how will SDGs help artisanal mining?
Well, that's a subject I've worked on pretty much all my adult life, and it still confounds me. It's a challenge. Between 15 and 20% of the world's gold comes from artisanal small-scale miners. And I think the creation of the SDGs in 2015 changed the narrative and made it possible to get greater attention from markets, from governments, from donors on artisanal small-scale mining, and how this offers both a threat and an opportunity to the realization of the SDGs. So artisanal miners are both subjects and objects for the SDGs. There are things that they can do themselves, actions they can take, or they should take, to help contribute to the sustainable development of their communities. And there's been a really interesting work done by PACT in the University of Delaware, published in 2020, on the ways that the ASM links up to the SDGs. So I encourage you to look at that report if you're interested in learning more. But of course, a country or a community's progress along the SDGs impacts the artisanal miners as citizens, but also in terms of the boundaries of possibility for them as economic actors. So when you have artisanal miners operating in contexts where there's conflict or high risk of corruption or a lot of money laundering coming through the gold sector, or a higher risk of human rights violations, extreme gender inequalities, and so on. So where you see very low performance on some of the SDGs, you find that it's much harder for those artisanal small-scale miners to professionalize, to formalize, to be integrated into the responsible formal economy. And they end up getting excluded from responsible supply chains. I know that the World Gold Council has just published a report led by Edward Bickham on large-scale and artisanal interactions. And what there you go, Philippa, what large-scale mining companies have been doing on that. I really welcome that report, and I see that as an example of the gold sector's leadership. This is an issue that I've been banging on about for years, because it's not just in gold, it's also in cobalt and colored gemstones and other materials. And there are so many structural barriers to ASM and LSM cohabiting or cooperating, often because of governments not doing their jobs. And so to have the gold sector set out and really research what the World Gold Council members are doing and share all those examples really helps inspire not just a dialogue, but action. And so this is an example of where I think the gold sector as a whole, through this attention on ASM, is helping drive the agenda on sustainable development goals for the sector as a whole.
Bringing in Lara, who's based in Africa, what changes on the ground have you seen there with regards to artisanal mining?
I'll change your question around slightly, because I have a comment, if that's okay. So one of the key factors, and I do a lot of trading, commodity trading as well in my business, and one of the things we notice with the small scales is the barrier is that they can't, one, get access to capital, and they can't open an LC, for instance, a letter of credit. They can't get onto, if you're in South Africa, the Transnet line or Richards Bay terminals or anything like that. So they're kind of forced to sell extremely domestic. So ex-mine, for instance, which is sort of the lowest national way you can sell. And there's very few buyers, especially overseas buyers, that are prepared to take commodities X mine or X works, because that presents a lot of risk. You have to have somebody on the ground to move cargo and so forth. And what ends up happening is a lot of these, they're not only artisanals, they're also community-based, I suppose, community-based mines, which are small scale, but are legal. So they're not classified as artisanal in the true sense. But what actually happens is they start earning pennies on the dollar. So, manganese price is 4.6 at the moment, or I think it's gone up now, 5.3, but you might get not even $2. So this is where you start getting the disparities. And a lot of what needs to happen, in my opinion, in order to get artisanals sort of the mainstream and to help them uplift themselves, is to start getting fair value for the commodities that they provide. And that needs to happen more and more. And there's, I suppose there's a pathway to doing that. And there are certain barriers to doing that. One is, as I mentioned, is access to capital. How do you get access to capital? How do you legalize these co-ops? Do you give a piece of land and then say mine? Who takes them? Who has the risk? Is it who's going to take the risk? Is it the logistics company that's going to upfront that risk? Is it the banks that are going to upfront that risk? Is it what they're trying to do in South Africa in the scrap industry was to create a floor price that you couldn't export, or you were forced to take a certain percentage of scrap in-house from domestic suppliers, and that precluded the ability to export. So you got a raised price for that. I think it happened with mixed success, frankly. But these are sort of the challenges that is faced by ASMs and by governments and stakeholders that try to help them.
Thank you very much.
If I may jump here and say on this topic, one example that always kind of stays with me is gold mining companies can offer alternative jobs. And I loved it when Philippa took me in Ghana to introduce me to a former artisanal miner who has developed a chicken farming business. And here is an example as to how do we train locals to think outside the box, that there's other ways of actually having a sustainable business.
Thank you very much for that. I think we've just got time to squeeze in one last sort of question, because we're at the sort of 50-minute or so mark. And this is for anyone and all of you. What is gold's value proposition to society? Who would like to have a stab at answering that?
I'll jump first because I could summarize it in one sentence for me.
Okay.
For me, gold is a storage of long-term value that can be leveraged to accelerate positive social impacts.
Okay. Does anyone have any closing thoughts to add to Anna's definition?
Yeah, can I give a few examples? Because I think sometimes we forget the important role that gold, for instance, plays in financial inclusion, financial security. For instance, if we think about India, when women get married, and that goes back to SDG 5, right? They are given gold, and that is what their security is. And if they want to leave their marriage or they hit hard times, they sell that gold. So that is really their security is gold. Another example, I think, is around financial resilience. And there's a great example about Aceh in Indonesia, and when the tsunami hit back in 2004, and it's written in Extreme Economies by Richard Davies. It's a great story. People took their gold, and that's how they were able to rebuild so quickly, because they could use that gold. And I think we all know that the role that gold plays in technology and diagnostics, in all the COVID tests and things like that. So I think whilst those stories, you know, it's small quantities, but gold plays a very, very important role for all of this.
Mm-hmm. Could I add a final thought, please? Which is that you asked your question is, what is gold's value proposition to society? I think it could be bigger than what it is already. I think we need to think about the fact that businesses change societies, whether they mean to or not, intentionally and unintentionally. I think if we can get the gold sector, and by that I mean all actors in it, refiners, investors, miners, governments, industry associations, initiatives, to actually think about how they wield power. They wield power to change things for the better or the worse. And if they can own that and be intentional with that, using the SDGs framework for really maximizing their contribution to society, then not only can we see that gold's value proposition to society will be much greater, but we'll see the social license to operate for gold as being much more deeply enhanced. And that's really necessary now, where consumers question products they don't understand, products that they might see as substitutable. And certainly in some of the international expert working groups I sit on, or the projects I'm working on, I hear really strong voices that say, we don't need to mine any more gold. Or consultants I know that say, I'm no longer offering my sustainability services to the gold sector because I feel I can have a greater impact doing it elsewhere. So I think there's a little bit of a caution there. And I really want to invite all the listeners to think about what more they in their organizations could do to really grow gold's value proposition to society through the SDGs.
Well, thank you very much for that, Estelle. And actually, a big thank you for all of our panelists. So huge thank you to Annie Markova, to Estelle Levin-Nally, to Lara Smith, to Philippa Varis, and to Hannah Brandstaetter. This was Andrew Thake from